In this sense, we have made it clear that any further NATO movement to the east is unacceptable. There is nothing unclear about this. We are not deploying our missiles over at the borders of the US. No. On the other hand, the US is deploying its missiles close to our home, on the porch of our house.
If anyone from the outside intends to interfere in what's happening, then they should know this. If they create threats for us, threats of a strategic nature, our retaliation, our counterstrike will be instantaneous. We have all the necessary instruments, ones that no one else can boast of. All the decisions on this have already been taken.
NATO foreign ministers have met in Latvia to discuss a response to Russia's military build-up on Ukraine's border.
In late February 2022, the Russian Federation, led by Vladimir Putin, invaded Ukraine in an act which has turned international relations upside down. There are many reasons why Putin has engaged in this era-defining act of aggression, but perhaps one of the foremost is his desire to prevent a further eastward expansion of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led by the United States. In this video, we explore the history of NATO and Russia's changing attitudes towards the alliance both during the Cold War era and since the 1990s. In order to provide a greater insight into this crucial aspect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A quick message before we begin examining the history of relations between NATO and Russia. To say that if you are enjoying our content, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you could share details of our videos with others as well, it would really help us out and enable us to keep delivering you our content. Thanks, and now back to the video. NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the Cold War. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a child of the Cold War. No sooner had the Second World War ended in the early summer of 1945. But tensions began to develop between the Western Allied nations such as the United States, Britain and France, and the Soviet Union. Because of the manner in which the war had proceeded between 1943 and 1945, at its end, Russia was effectively in control of Eastern Europe and much of Central Europe, while the Western Allies had control of the western part of the continent and parts of Central Europe, including West Germany. In the months that followed, the Soviets began creating communist states all across their zone of influence, notably in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. As the Iron Curtain descended across Central Europe and tensions ratcheted up, the Western powers began agreeing treaties of mutual aid to each other in the event of an attack on them by the Soviets. This was a necessity, as a country like West Germany or France would be incapable of fighting off an attack by the Soviets by themselves. Thus, France and Britain agreed to an alliance in 1947 under the terms of the Treaty of Dunkirk, as this soon grew to include the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. However, what was really needed was the military backing of the United States. Thus, in April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established. There were 12 members originally: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Iceland, and Denmark. They were soon joined by Greece and Turkey in 1952, as the government of Harry Truman in Washington sought to prevent these two nations falling into the Soviet camp. Then in 1955, West Germany was also admitted. This was seen as a deliberate act of provocation by the Soviet Union, and they immediately responded by forming the Warsaw Pact, a similar alliance consisting of the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Albania. And so it was that Europe was divided into two military alliances: NATO dominating Western and all parts of Central Europe, and the Warsaw Pact dominating most of Central Europe and all of Eastern Europe. It would go on like this for over 35 years as the Cold War continued. End of the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact ends, but NATO lives on. The strategic situation of these two military alliances changed abruptly in the late 1980s. During this time, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev began implementing radical reforms of the Soviet Union and loosened Moscow's grip over its vassal states in Eastern Europe. As it did so, the communist regimes there began to fall from power. In 1990, after a political revolution in East Germany the previous year, Germany reunified as a Western liberal democracy. As it did, it left the Warsaw Pact. This was followed just months later in February 1991 by a meeting in Hungary, where the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, was formally terminated. In the months that followed, the Soviet Union itself collapsed and broke up into constituent countries such as Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Thus, the end of the Cold War spelled the end of both the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But NATO lived on. Short of its original reason for existing, to protect Europe's democratic nations from Soviet aggression, it nevertheless managed to refashion itself as an instrument of the Pax Americana, which followed in the 1990s, the age of US dominance in global relations. And that is the cause of much of the unrest in Eastern Europe today. NATO in the new millennium, an expanding alliance. While the Warsaw Pact came to an end as the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO continued to go from strength to strength. There was an immediate push in the 1990s by certain former members of the Warsaw Pact to become members of NATO. 3 of these, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, which soon became 4 when the latter nation split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, formed into the Visegrad Group in February 1991, with the goal of pushing for their integration into both the European Union and NATO. In March 1999, 3 of these nations, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, joined the military alliance, while no less than 7 nations joined in March 2004. The latter included Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, many of which were former Warsaw Pact countries, and 2 of which, Estonia and Latvia, which have borders with the Russian Federation. This was the first time that countries with direct borders with Russia had joined the alliance in the post-Cold War period. Interestingly, there was widespread policy discussion and concern in the 1990s, as the alliance was being expanded, that doing so could be sowing the seeds of future conflicts in Europe and Eastern Europe in particular. Indeed, in the summer of 1997, a group of 50 former US senators, cabinet secretaries, and ambassadors submitted a letter to Bill Clinton's government, outlining their grave reservations at what they believed could become a costly policy decision and could lead to distrust of Western intentions in Russia. Despite these concerns, further countries have joined since, they being Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. But the real flashpoints between Russia and the United States in terms of NATO expansion in recent years have been around potential memberships, notably the possibility of Sweden, Finland, or Ukraine, 2 of which have massive borders with Russia, potentially joining the alliance. As we will see, the potential for such enlargements of the alliance have been one of the foremost drivers of increasing tensions between Russia and the West in recent times. We hope you are enjoying the video so far and are finding it informative. Just a quick reminder that if you are finding the video useful, to please like it and share it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. We publish similar content very regularly, so be sure and subscribe in order to not miss out on anything. And now back to the video. A resurgent Russia. The enlargement of NATO in the 1990s and the early 21st century has been occurring just as Russia has become resurgent. In the 1990s, following the end of the Cold War, the country descended into a crippling economic collapse, which left it a shadow of itself for several years. Moreover, by the late 1990s, the country was being governed by a man, Boris Yeltsin, who was crippled himself by his chronic alcoholism. But in May 2000, Vladimir Putin succeeded Yeltsin as president of Russia. The country was already recovering from the economic collapse of the 1990s by this time, and Putin became a symbol of a new modern 21st century Russia, which would be shorn of the overt authoritarianism of the 20th century Soviet Union. The latter hope proved to be unfounded, as became clear in the years that followed, as Putin manipulated the Russian constitution to remain in power beyond his initial 8-year term as president, and entered into numerous wars in regions such as Georgia to press Russian claims to territory in these areas, which had formerly comprised part of the Soviet Union. New geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West. Soon, Putin's aggressive foreign policy stance was generating tensions between Russia and the West. Some of this related to Russia's aggressive stance in the Caucasus regions, but it also extended into the Middle East. For instance, Russian support for Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria throughout the long-running civil war there since 2001 has been a cause of major unrest during a conflict which has resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 people, and seen 13 million people either become refugees or displaced internally within Syria. Similarly, Russia has often supported sides in conflicts in Africa, which are opposed to the regimes the United States, Britain, and others wish to establish in these regions. A notable example is in Libya, where a similarly long and destructive civil war to that which has ravaged Syria has been ongoing. Thus, tensions have been growing on a wide range of fronts between Russia and the West, most of which nations are now part of NATO for many years. The issue of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. While the conflicts in Syria, Libya, and other nations have been sources of tension between Russia and the nations who make up NATO for several years, it is the issue of NATO expansion itself into former Soviet territories, which has become the foremost source of tension between Russia and the West during Putin's tenure as head of Russia. However, contrary to Putin's rhetoric about Western aggression, the West has often been willing to oblige Moscow in this respect. A NATO summit in 2008, for instance, declared that both Ukraine and Georgia had ambitions of joining the alliance and would be allowed to, but an abundance of impediments were then put in the way by NATO authorities, which would then block this from ever actually happening. That is until 2014, when the Maidan uprising in Ukraine saw a change of political direction in that country, and a real concerted effort in the years that followed to speed along Ukrainian membership. It is this issue more than any other which contributed to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine early in 2022.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Thus, NATO's expansion since the end of the Cold War is absolutely key to understanding the nature of the conflict in Eastern Europe today. Future relations? What will happen next is anyone's guess. In the short run, it seems that the decision by Putin to invade Russia will actually see a further expansion of NATO in the years ahead. For instance, no sooner had Russian tanks started heading for Kiev and surrounding Mariupol in late February 2022. Then a number of countries which had formerly remained neutral in Europe began reconsidering their position. Most notable in this respect are Sweden and Finland, the latter of which has a huge land border with Russia. Other countries in Europe who are not members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and which have a long tradition of remaining neutral in wars, such as Ireland, are also reconsidering their stance, as is Austria. The former had remained outside of NATO as a result of an agreement in 1955 between Washington and Moscow, that the country would not join either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. Thus, Russia's effort to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO is having the direct opposite effect in the short term of leading many non-aligned nations in Europe to consider applying for membership.
Если Россия столкнется с такой угрозой, как принятие Украины в Североатлантический альянс, в НАТО.
Moreover, those countries who feel most directly threatened by Russian aggression, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, each of whom are already members of NATO, have called on Washington to deploy greater military resources in their countries to act as a deterrent to Moscow. There are other issues at work which will determine the future of Russia-NATO relations. One of the major issues is that there is no obvious line of succession in Russia. Putin does not have a political heir, and the earlier obvious successor, the former president Dmitry Medvedev, has been sidelined in recent years. Without a clear idea of who will actually succeed Putin, it is difficult to see where relations might go in the long term. But if Putin remains healthy and in power for the next 10 to 15 years, then further conflict with NATO and the Western powers is inevitable. Moreover, this may become part of a broader international polarization as China begins to exert its power in a more concerted fashion in the Pacific. For instance, the People's Republic may be willing to support further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe in return for Russia's support for Chinese intervention in and annexation of Taiwan in future years. If this happens, things could get very messy, potentially with further acts of Russian aggression to prevent Finland in particular joining NATO, and a possible imposition of a pro-Russian government in Moldova. Alternatively, a drift in American politics back to the sort of government seen under Donald Trump between 2017 and 2021 could see Washington deciding to play a much more limited role in Europe. If this happens, the onus will be on France and Germany to provide for Europe's safety against Russian aggression. No matter what happens, the self-evident truth of 2022 is that the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's clear statement of antipathy towards NATO's expansion has moved the world closer to a potentially cataclysmic conflict that it hasn't been in decades. And that's our video on the history of relations between NATO and Russia, and how the same are impacting on world geopolitics today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like it and be sure to check out our other content. Share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channels.